Ta-da! We've gone live apparently. Well, welcome everyone to this session called Contemporary Governance Practices, a Values-Based Look at Bylaws. So it was funny when I put that title together, somebody told me, don't put bylaws in the title because nobody will come to your session. But I hear we have a pretty robust crowd. So I think we'll have an interesting conversation today. I'd love to hear what you all think. And we'll just jump right to it. I'm going to have them show only the slides. You shouldn't see my talking head at the same time because I think it'll make it broader on your screen. So we're going to just take a closer look today, and you can ask questions. There is a delay, so you can ask questions, and the moderator will feed them to me, and I'll do my best to answer them. This format is a tricky format. I would much rather be with all of you in person, and I hope to be able to do so in the fall, and more on that to come later. My name is Laura Deitrick. I am the Associate Director of the Nonprofit Institute, and I also direct all of the graduate, master's degree, and undergraduate programs in nonprofit leadership and management at the University of San Diego. You can read the academic bio somewhere. If you go to the next slide, please. I'm going to give you a pop quiz. So, is this a cute puppy? Everyone just says, I can hear you all resoundingly say, yes, that is a very cute puppy. The next pop quiz question is, am I a lawyer? The answer is what you would say to the puppy. No, no, no. I am not a lawyer. I want to be very clear about that. Apparently, I think I am a doctor, but it's not a medical doctor. So the fine print here is nothing that I say today in this presentation should in any way be construed as legal advice. I'm going to just talk to you about some ways that a person who is not a lawyer but is interested in governance and cares about governance spent some time thinking about bylaws and learned some things along the way. Okay, if you would go to the next slide, please. A brief overview. So why do we need bylaws? Who even uses them? I'm going to look at a quick case study of an organization that I belong to where we did a bylaws review 2 years ago, and I learned some really interesting things, especially related to presenting issues of DEI that were going on in that organization, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to look at a bylaws review project that some students did and give you what our general observations were out of that project and some lessons learned. Then tell you some updates you should make now, and then present some things you may want to consider for your own organization, and hopefully hear from you, and then a little quick overview on how to review your bylaws. And then if you could go to the next slide, I can hear you guys talking. I'm just telling the moderator that note. Okay, so what are bylaws? I think when we talk about them, I don't know, this is the kind of an image that comes to my mind, some dusty document on a shelf somewhere, right? And then I like to think about how do board members even get their bylaws, right? If you're a board member, I'm a board member, I'm a proud board member. Usually you get the bylaws when you join the board. Somebody hands you a board notebook or board packet, and you read them, maybe or not, but they're likely shared that way. And they signal something to that new board member, which I think is important to understand. So at that point in time, if they're hard to read, they don't make sense, or they're full of legalese, you might want to think about making them more user-friendly. But maybe they get a cursory glance. What I've noticed from time to time, they usually get brought out when there's a dispute about something in the organization, or there's some kind of crisis. And I usually can count on 1 or 2 board members having read them all, every single one, and they know the section and the number, and they use that sometimes to hammer home their own points. I don't know if this is true in your own organizations, but what I really kind of want to say is these documents codify our organizational practices, right? So what we do is driven by, in governance anyway, what the bylaws tell us, our major actions, right? They are the essential tool that outlines how the board will govern. They're the roadmap for governance. And I'm going to just make the case that bylaws are not boring. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Keeping that in mind, right? If we think about governance as a dynamic reflection of what the board is supposed to do, when it governs, then the bylaws can be considered an artifact of the board's culture. Framed this way, the importance of these documents is elevated and really brings it into focus. So in an era where many people are talking about values and trying to express their values in their organizations and in their own personal lives, I want to make the case that you can express and ground your organizational values in your governance practices. And if you don't come back and then tether those practices to the bylaws, you mostly have what we would call espoused values. You say things, but your organizational structure or the organizational roadmap, in this case, the bylaws, doesn't enforce the behavior that you're looking for. So let me talk a little bit about that and about organizational values. If you could flip to the next slide, please. So over the past few years, and I think in the opening plenary, they discussed this in depth, so it's nothing really new, but especially in the wake of renewed calls for racial justice, many nonprofits and their boards have made public statements calling for racial equity, increased efforts to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and the like. Yet many boards remain predominantly white. So on these next two slides, I'm going to set the backdrop for you a little bit with data that we already have about San Diego. On the top of this slide, this is for San Diego. You know, for those of you that don't know, we do an annual study of nonprofit leaders every year. This is from last year, and we get a really pretty good response. And so we've asked folks to kind of self-identify, right? And you can see that if you look at the population of San Diego in that little dotted box, 55% of San Diego residents identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, or BIPOC. That was how the question was asked. Then we asked the respondents to tell us, well, what percentage of your leadership team, your CEO, your board, and your board chair, to the best of your abilities, can you tell us, identify as a Black, Indigenous person of color? So you can see on that top bar chart that in San Diego, we are not hitting the mark. Our boards are not representative, at least in terms of race, ethnicity of our broader population. So that's one thing people have focused on. The other thing we've asked over the years, we've asked for at least 5 years now on this particular survey is, you know, how satisfied are you with organizational progress? So most folks will respond in the affirmative. We are willing to discuss concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But when it comes to, are you moving the needle on that? The answers drop off. Fewer are able to implement the goals and objectives that they aspire to. So, you know, put in a different language, we know what we're supposed to be doing and we know what we want to do, but we're having a hard time taking that to action or realizing that objective. And then I have, if you can go to the next slide, I have one other backdrop slide that I want to share with you. And I'm going to give you a second to kind of look at it and I'll explain it to you. At the top of the chart, you can see the percent of organizations that actually provide training in diversity, equity, and inclusion. The bulk of the training has been focused on the staff. And you know, 25% of organizations told us they'd focus that training on their board. So if we want to talk about possible strategies for moving the needle on increasing diversity, research shows us that training on racial diversity is less effective at making progress towards racial equity than actual structural changes such as policies, or in the case of our talk today, bylaws, which in the nonprofit sector is really the job of the board, right, to determine and set policy and to follow their bylaws. So in the top chart, you can see that the board knows, I mean, you know, we know we're supposed to be doing these things, but boards aren't focusing this effort necessarily on themselves, at least in terms of training. And then, you know, what can nonprofits do? Well, the chart at the bottom gives us a very, very beginning step, I think, a way to think about this. And so if you look at this chart on the bottom, I'm going to walk through it because I know sometimes it takes me a little while to understand charts really quickly, like in this kind of format. So we asked the CEOs to self-identify ethnicity. And if you look at the two pie charts on the very top, those are the responses. If the organization's CEO identified as BIPOC, they reported the diversity of their leadership team and their board to be 49% and 61% BIPOC. Now, the answer changes when we ask and the CEO identifies as white, where we see a quarter identifying their leadership team as Black, Indigenous, people of color, or the board. Okay, so that's for the CEO. We have the results also if the board chair is a person, a BIPOC person, and the proportions are almost exactly the same. Okay, so this gives us a little bit of an idea. Folks that are CEOs may not be moving on quickly or be able to financially say, let me step out of the way and have somebody fill my spot. But board chairs turn over pretty regularly. And this is where I kind of want to pick up this conversation on bylaws. I just wanted to give you this information as a backdrop to what I want to talk about while we spend our time together. Very quickly, I want to say, you can go to the next slide, absolutely. There's a difference between bylaws and policies, and if at all you're inspired to go look at your bylaws after this, you will note that sometimes a lot of policy stuff tends to show up in the bylaws that can probably be stripped out. So, the bylaws can be thought of as higher level, while policies and things that need to be more amenable to change can be, codified in more operating policies, right? But your operating policies must align with your bylaws. So there's a one-on-one difference between bylaws and policies. Okay, let's get to my case study. How did I become interested in this tool as a way to improve practices on the board? You can go to the next slide. I'll share a small case study. So I am a member of a lovely organization that where many of my colleagues from around the country are. It's called the Nonprofit Academic Centers Council. We call it NAC for short. And this group is made up of members of people like me from universities that run academic programs that teach nonprofit management. So we technically as a group should know something about governance and bylaws, and we do. And these are although I'm sure to you it sounds like maybe a very dull organization, it is some of the best and hardest working people that I know. So before I launch into the case study, I wanted to say that. So this is an academic membership organization, and it's volunteer driven. We have one executive director, but in the early days, it was completely volunteer driven, and it's in its membership. And it kind of evolved as an organization like many small startups, as very few people do many things, right? And wear many hats. I'm not telling you folks in the audience anything you don't already know about nonprofit management. But in the last 5 to 10 years, membership had really grown. These programs have sprouted up all over the country. We have many members, and there was beginning to be a prevailing perception, especially on behalf of women in the organization, that we had kind of an old boys club on our hands, because in the early days, that's who started the organization, right? And this was not done, I don't believe, in any way, shape, or form on purpose, but it was an observation that was becoming less and less satisfactory for the membership. Decision-making was not viewed by a majority of the membership as transparent. As hard as the board tried to do these things, people weren't satisfied with the progress. Nomination and committee appointments were not perceived as equitable, and member demands and espoused values of the board. So member demands, right? And what the board really wanted to be. So we weren't out of sync. The board and the membership weren't necessarily out of sync. Everyone wanted to move forward on this. But it led really to a bylaws review. So I want to, against that backdrop, tell you what happened. So we looked at, you can go to the next slide. The NAC board, in all its wisdom, did some really important work together as a board and then made two decisions that they thought would help increase inclusiveness. So we're really focusing here, yes, on diversity and equity, but this idea of an inclusive environment is, in this case, really central. How do people get in, right? And they looked at a new process for recruiting members to participate in the committees and as well as on the board. So on the right-hand side, these are the two decisions that they came forward with. And they're highlighted, the important parts for me. The board recommended a revised process and duties for the nominating committee. So nominating, how did people even get involved? Because it seemed to be a mystery for everybody. And then an audit, they really requested an audit of needed board member skills and attributes. And that did not necessarily mean, I see this, how do you avoid the stigma of a diversity hire? We'll come back to that. But this audit of what does the board really need? And are we just asking our friends because it's easy and because we're all volunteers and we're all busy? Or are we doing something very systematic that broadens and opens up opportunities for folks? So this triggered a review of the bylaws because that's where these kinds of processes are outlined. And I had the good fortune of spending time with probably the leading authority on governance in the academic world, anyway, Dave Renz, and a few other colleagues to review these bylaws. So go ahead and skip to the next slide, please. And after we reviewed them, we made some practices that needed to be codified and really promote the behaviors that we wanted to achieve. So these are the things we recommended, and I'll just tell you, and I'm going to show you in just a second. But we inserted a statement on diversity and inclusion in one section of the bylaws. We created a new article that outlined the creation of standing and ad hoc committees. It was really loose how committees got formed. And then where did they draw board members from? Well, they drew them from committees. So if you never could figure out how to get on a committee and your committees weren't well-rounded and representative, then you were never getting on the board, right? Just you're sort of systematically ruled out. We did some restructuring of the naming of things. That's not as important for what we're doing today. And then we instituted and we required that the governance committee conduct an annual audit of what did the board really need in terms of skills, and what were they looking for, and instead of just finding somebody who was willing to serve, really created a process where people had to thoughtfully think about, here's what we need people to do, and these are the kinds of folks we're looking for. And then I'll show you a couple other things we did really quickly. You can go ahead to the next slide. So there was really very little written about nominations, right? If I did a side-by-side here, you'd see like 3 sentences on the original, and this is what we came up with. But I wanted to say, just keep thinking about how policies either make things narrow or how they open them up, right? So we did this, we changed these language to, so people were notified of meetings, so that people kept saying, we don't know how these decisions get made, right? And an all hands on deck kind of mentality really wasn't going to serve this organization very well as it matured. So we codified a bunch of that. In the second one, no more than one faculty member from a particular institution can serve on any one committee. So you can't stack a committee. So I can't get all my USD folks to sit on one committee and make all the decisions that we want. It forces them, the organization, to go more broadly into its membership. And the committee members themselves will elect a chair or co-chair. That's in the bullet point below. And, it doesn't mean that you have to do these policies, but what I'm trying to say is keep thinking very carefully about, what do your policies force you to do? How do they shape your behavior? And do they point you in the direction that you really want your organization to be going in? And I'm using diversity, equity, inclusion right now as an example, but it could really be anything that's important to you. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Oh, there it is. So there's the well, no, that's not it. Let me just take a quick look here because my face is covering part of the slide, so I can't see it. Oh, you can see. So yeah, oh, that's right. So I get tasked with a bylaws review. I'm a professor. I'm teaching a bunch of undergraduates. So I think, let me not work so hard. I had my students review them before we did. And this was a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it was really interesting what they came back with. These are my undergraduate students. And one thing that they said to us is, hey, you guys don't even say anywhere in your organizing documents, there's no commitment to DEI. There's no commitment to this work. There's no statement of equal employment or etc. And so taking that comment to heart, because we'd have statements like this, the committee decided we wanted our bylaws to signal our beliefs. So we added our DEI commitment statement, which is on the right-hand side, into our organizational purpose. So in our bylaws, when you open our bylaws for NAC, you'll see section like 1 is the name of the organization, 2 is something else, and 1.03 right up in front under purpose of the organization. And all bylaws are different. You may not have a stated purpose section, but this is where we elected to put this statement in our bylaws. This is not mandated by law in any way, shape, or form. This was our choice. So I'm just sharing it with you. If you're thinking that you might want to do something similar, you might find it fits better in a different part of your bylaws, but we elected to place it straight up front so that anyone who even takes a first glance at the bylaws is going to see that this is our commitment. Make sense? Okay. We can go to the next slide. So building on the success of that project, and this was very well received, and it's had some very positive effects on our organization at NAC. But building on the success of that project, in the spring, I had another class this year. And I had the students, I asked them if they wanted to review a set of bylaws, but I didn't have a set to look at. So we put out a Facebook post thinking some nonprofit might want us to look at their bylaws. And we had 7 organizations write us back. And so I couldn't say no to any of them. So I actually only had 6 students in this class this particular semester. So I actually had to do a set as well. We each took on a set of the bylaws to review. And I want to share with you some of that. And I'm going to show you a slide in just a second. That is a terrible slide to put in a presentation, but I just want to, so you don't have to read it, but I want you to get a flavor of how we did this analysis. So you can flip to the next slide, the terrible slide. So first thing we did was we lined up all the organizations. I don't have their names in here. And we looked at all of their bylaws and kind of saw what they had in common and what sections people had and where they were missing things. And then we looked at the state model bylaws, which are very helpful, and I'll give you a link to those at the end. And we mapped where there were gaps, and everyone had a gap somewhere. And some of these things, not to say that these sections were well written, but did they even have them? And so we provided this back to the organizations at the end. And we also made, you can go to the next slide, 5 general recommendations to the folks that was common to all of these organizations. So one, and I'm going to show you specifics on this in just a minute, but one, we recommended, we've just been through what is probably the biggest emergency of many organizations' lives, a pandemic, a section on how to govern in case of emergency. 2, how to include required policies in your bylaws. 3, we gave recommendations for a lot of what I've already talked about and how ensuring bylaws promote diversity, equity, inclusion. 4, integrate organizational values into your bylaws. I gave you that example from the NAC piece on that statement of commitment to DEI. And then 5, meetings. Many people, all of the organizations, and most people have this in their bylaws, they have a section on meetings, but they are not updated. I can guarantee you the word Zoom was not in any of those bylaws, okay? So you do want to take a look at your meetings and update it to include contemporary practices. What are you doing now, okay? I'm going to go into the first 3 more in depth. You can go to the next slide. So the state of California has a set of model bylaws and has updates to corporate law through a link that I'll give you at the end of the presentation. And they've put forth some model language that folks might want to consider if they want to add a section on how to govern in case of emergency. These are not my words. These come from that website. And so you can just get an idea of what it would be. But, you really have to make your bylaws your own. I love to start with boilerplate language and then make sure it fits for the organization. So what you see here is how to govern, and then all these various things that the state has recommended. So this is boilerplate language for sure. If you want to skip to the next slide. So many organizations have finally caught up with Sarbanes-Oxley rules. You have to have conflict of interest statement, document retention and destruction statements, whistleblower protection, and many people have like EEOC or the DEI statements as well. And there's actually a way you can handle these in your bylaws. So in some of the bylaws we reviewed, people put the whole conflict of interest statement, right? Or some people had, maybe half of it, or they give a nod to it or whatever. Anyway, what I learned was that the most common practice is mention that you have the policy, right? So have a section that mentions the policy, then you add the policy as an appendix to your bylaws. So you don't have to take up pages and pages of your bylaws with these documents, but you want to give a nod in the governing documents to the fact that you adhere to these laws. Okay, and that's one way to do it. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Just a short blurb with a link to an appendix, right? Or point to a policy manual or some such thing where the whole policy is laid out for you. Okay, so required policies, that was something we noticed was kind of all over the map across all 7 of the organizations. You can flip to the next document. So I talked a lot a bit about this idea of how do we think about diversifying the board, and how do we tether ourselves or hold ourselves accountable? How do our policies drive our behavior? So what I would recommend all of you do who are interested in doing this kind of update or looking at is look very carefully at how people come on the board, how they stay on the board, how they get onto committees, how vacancies are filled. That's another place where in a lot of the bylaws it was kind of vague and people could just pick somebody, which may work for your organization. All of what you have right now may very well work for your organization. What I'm suggesting is if you take a look and want to decide, well, you know what, maybe we want to drive a little bit different practice, you can do so by looking at these. Term limits. Which are controversial in nonprofits. They are not required by law, but I can tell you I'm a fan, and I can tell you I have colleagues that are not fans. I think they help you revitalize your organization, move people, they force you to kind of bring fresh air into the organization, and they can help break up some of these less diverse boards if you know that you have to if you have planned turnover on the board. And then another section that's really interesting, and I think a lot of people take boilerplate language, is removal from the board. So we see a huge variation here from you can be removed for any reason to you must commit felony murder to get off of the board, to be kicked off of our board. So I think spending some time with how people are removed from the board is equally as important to consider as how they're brought onto the board, right? So the other thing, it's not on this slide, but I received a set of bylaws from a different membership organization I'm in. All the members had to approve them, where the organization had switched all of its language to gender neutral language. Again, may not be something your board wants to do, but since I'm talking about new and emerging practices, I wanted to mention that that as well. So something else you could comb through your bylaws and take a look at. So these, I originally titled this slide like gateways, right? Because each of these points on the left-hand side are places where you can either open the gate wider or shut it down just by the words that you write in there. And so I invite you to think carefully about how your bylaws dictate your behavior in these ways, especially if you're trying to create more opportunity and inclusiveness on your board. Okay, I just have a couple more. So if you have questions, we'll get to them in a second, or maybe we'll get done a little early even. Other common pitfalls that I saw and that my students saw. And by the way, I thought we were going to get this project done in 2 weeks. It took us the whole semester. We worked on it every week. I'm sure my students think I'm crazy, but we had a good time with it. But it took us a long time, and we did deliver back a memo to each organization that had those key 5 recommendations on it. And then any place where we saw major issues, they were unique to each organization. They got a unique, there was a section of the report that they got back that was unique to them. So some things that we saw was a lack of consistency throughout documents. So you can tell that people have augmented or changed and adopted in different sections of their bylaws at different times. And you could tell by the language. So some felt like cut and paste boilerplate legal language that they got from somewhere else, and others felt like more chatty language that was probably written when they first wrote their bylaws. So you could tell, and then terms would sometimes lack consistency. So they might say board chair in one section and board president in another section. And just, I think all of that is to say clarity and consistency throughout the document is really important. Then what we saw was people were either, in some places, too vague. So we've talked about the importance of having some specifics, but you can also err on the side of being way too specific. You cannot legislate all behavior through policy. I've learned that as much as you want to, or through governance documents. So what is the bare minimum that you need to convey that will get the action that you hope for? So again, I talked about this at the beginning. If you look at, in this, we saw this in our NAC bylaws, we stripped a ton of it out. We would say, this is how you're going to, this is how the board chair gets elected. And then it was like all this descriptive policy language that was not necessary. And so we moved that out and into a policy document, an operating policies document instead. So are you being way too prescriptive? So we saw a little bit of both. And then lastly, not user-friendly. So the model bylaw link that I'll share with you at the end of this, I think, looks clean, it's tidy, there's not tons of section 1.0.7.3.e dash whatever, they're just easy to read. The major headings were readable, because if they're not, no one's going to read them. So we wrote back to the organizations. Remember, we had 7 of them, local, couple small, couple really big organizations. And we said, it would really help us in our review if you tell us how the bylaws get used. And so many people wrote back and said, hardly ever. We never look at them. And yet they're legal documents for your corporation, right? And probably because they're not useful. And then, way too much legalese. Yes, cut and paste language is great, but I'd read it again and say, does this actually help me understand what I'm going to do here? Because if it's too much of that, people won't read it and they won't use it either. The one section we did not review because we, again, told everyone we're not cute puppies and we're not lawyers, was the section that is always in there on indemnification. We did not cover that. We did not look at that. And I'm not going to talk about it today. So that you definitely want to talk about with your lawyer. So in the, I'm going to just do 2 more. Oh, will you go to the next slide, please? Okay. This is straight out of a blog called Nonprofit Law Blog. So why should you review, if I haven't convinced you to review them for any other reason, what are some reasons why you might want to review your bylaws? And you can take a look here, but and many of them are reflected in some of the items that I mentioned. But ultimately, well-drafted bylaws signal a well-governed organization. We live in an age of accountability now, where everything's just, a tweet away, basically. And for a nonprofit, your reputation is everything, right? My kids did not get the memo to not call me at this moment in time. Sorry. So we really want to make sure that these are also accountability documents. Okay. And you'll get a copy of this presentation, but they are the onboarding place, the first place a new board member does read about your organization. And they can really reflect your values. So go ahead to, I think I have two more slides. Okay, so how you want to do this review? There's all kinds of tips on how you should do it. But now that I've done 7 in the last year, I'm going to give you, and one, like I said, with the leading premier scholar on governance in the nation, we had a lot of fun, actually. I can tell you some things that I would recommend anyway. So typically, folks recommend that you review bylaws every 3 to 5 years. The problem with all of this, and I'm giving you some imagery on the right, is people think they can take a scalpel approach. And we thought this at NAC. We thought, well, if we just fix this one section, I can guarantee you it triggers and a ripple effect through the whole document. So my personal thought process is go top to bottom. Just if you're going to do it, go ahead and look from the beginning to the end and take care of it all at once. I would form a committee with really detail-oriented people. Because the details matter in these documents. Certain particular words even matter, and how they can contradict other sections becomes really important. But have a purpose. Why are you doing it? Because you're supposed to do it every 3 to 5 years, or because maybe you want to imbue more of your values. I think I would be really clear about why you want to do a bylaws review and have the group agree to that purpose. You can start the same way we did by comparing to other organizations. It's not hard to get sample bylaws. I highly recommend the California model bylaws that are available from the State Attorney General's office, I believe. Also check for updates, because they're making updates to corporate law pretty regularly, and they'll tell you new policies that you might want to add or not add. Does that mean your bylaws absolutely have to cover every single nuanced piece that somebody recommends? Not necessarily. Okay. And I would check with your own attorney on that, which is my last bullet point. Have legal counsel review your work. Always create side-by-side and or red line version, because people are going to want to know what you changed and why. Sometimes, this may come as a shock to everyone in this room, but sometimes organizations review bylaws because they want to change something that they can't get changed in other ways. They maybe want to limit somebody's power, right? Or they, want to change the composition of the board, and they, a stroke of the pen without many people paying attention can make a fundamental change that folks, didn't intend. So you want to be really open in your process. Most people will be so grateful. Other board members will be so grateful that you did it, that they may not get down into the fine detail. But and then, yes, of course, have somebody with legal knowledge review your work. If you want to go to the last slide, here are some resources that we used when we did these reviews, and there are hyperlinks in them, so they will definitely be available to you that you can use on your own, but I'll just look at them real quickly, and then I'll take any questions, or you guys can make comments on your own. I'd love to hear if any of you have done anything different. There's a website that gives really, I think, clear sample language. That's the first bullet point. And then the second bullet point is a place where you can check for updates. That's where we got that emergency, how to govern in case of an emergency language from. Board Source gives a really good bylaws, do's and don'ts. The California State AG's office guide for charities is, I think, helpful for anything legal or government governance related. And then helpful information for promoting DEI through the bylaws can be found on the link that I gave you at the very bottom from the American Bar. I found an article that I really liked there. So I would just conclude, you can take off this slides. I'm sure you have had a lot of opportunity to hear me talk. I'm sorry it was so talk oriented. This is a forum that's hard to generate dialogue in, but I study and work a lot around the issue or the phenomenon of organizational change. And people want to change their organizations. They want to do new things, and they talk and they make verbal commitments. But they rarely come back and tie those commitments into things that anchor them, such as policies, and in this case, bylaws. So hopefully in our chat together today, first of all, a bunch of you showed up. So I proved my colleague wrong who said if I put the name bylaws in my talk, nobody would come. And hopefully you're inspired to think about, how do we take these kind of archaic, dusty documents and make them live and breathe and really reflect our values as an organization. Okay, I've got a question at the bottom, so I'm going to look, but I'm at that age, so forgive me for the glasses. It says, how are bylaws to be revised, especially to align with corporate codes and laws? What organizations can help updating bylaws? Well, my students will be looking for projects again, so you can certainly offer your organization up for that. And then my problem is I can't see the whole question because of how the screen is. So give me just a second. Is there a regulatory body who can help if there's a governance dispute or a place to lodge a complaint about it? That's all, okay, from my very non-lawyer point of view, all occurs with the state attorney general in California. Okay, in terms of if you have a complaint, go to their website and look at their charities section. And those sources that I gave you, I hope you feel a little inspired that you could take on some of this work yourselves. I mean, like I said, it was just fun to think about the document in a different way, right? Any other questions? I know there's a delay, so I'm going to wait. You can put them in the chat too, I think. Steve, come on, Steve. Oh, it's so nice to see your name there. I wish we could actually talk. What do you think is the average number of pages of a basic set of bylaws? I mean, I don't know about number of pages, but seriously, most of the ones that we read were not they were maybe under 10 pages long, 6 to 10-ish. That's a great question. Again, that's that balance between parsimony and prescription, right? If you're feeling the need to put absolutely everything in there to prescribe what people are going to do, I would say resist that urge. And if you look back at the slide I had at the beginning that talked about the difference between bylaws and policies, bylaws are much shorter and succinct, and you air all the details out in a policy. I'd have to go back and look at the pages, but trust me, my students who got the longer ones, some of them were single-spaced. And, you want people to actually read them and refer to them and use them. Any other questions? Oasis Center International. We would love to have an opportunity to have our bylaws reviewed would the school consider this request? So yes, we have our contact information. I will probably be leading a graduate team of students to do this kind of work in the fall, and definitely will keep this as an assignment for my spring students. If you can contact us at, let's see, what is it? www.sandiego. No, that's our website. Nonprofit@sandiego.edu. Nonprofit@sandiego.edu. And then my contact information, and Cynthia, who organized this, who was probably in correspondence with you about this, any of the conference organizers can point you right to me. So it's Laura Deitrick, and be happy to take a look. But I would use this guide, the stuff that we looked at, the general memo piece that I included, the 5 points that we made that were common to all the organizations that we looked at. And try doing it with a team of your board members. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.